Scenario 1. Columbus never reached America. What if Europe never touched the New World, and entire empires like the Aztec and Inca rose as equals to Europe? History is full of crossroads, moments when a single decision or accident could have changed everything. And one of the most fascinating what-if scenarios lies in the Age of Discovery, when Europe was just beginning to expand across oceans and continents. We often assume that Columbus discovering the Americas in 1492 was inevitable. Yet what if that journey had never happened? What if storms had sunk his fleet, or if the Spanish crown had denied his request permanently? This one twist could have delayed European contact with the New World by decades or even centuries, and the consequences would have been monumental. Without Columbus, the Spanish Empire would not have immediately gained access to the vast silver mines of the Americas. Silver from places like Potosi fueled the rise of Spain as the dominant power of the 16th century. It funded their armies, their global ambitions, and their wars across Europe. Without this sudden influx of wealth, Spain might have remained a regional kingdom, struggling with rivals like France and the Ottoman Empire. The balance of power in Europe would have shifted dramatically, and perhaps it would have been France or even England that rose as the first true global empire, centuries ahead of schedule. But beyond Europe, the fate of entire civilizations in the Americas would be altered. The Aztec and Inca empires fell so quickly in our timeline because Europeans arrived with steel weapons, horses, and most devastatingly, diseases like smallpox. If contact had been delayed, these empires could have continued to flourish, evolving politically and technologically without the sudden collapse brought on by foreign invaders. Imagine the Inca road stretching further across South America. Imagine the Aztec expanding trade and influence across Mesoamerica, and perhaps even experimenting with new forms of governance. These empires were not static, they were dynamic and innovative. Given more time, they could have built states that might stand equal to the powers of Europe. Of course, Europe would not stay away forever. Eventually, explorers from another nation would have crossed the Atlantic, but by then, the context would have been different. If the first contacts happened, say, in the late 1500s or early 1600s instead of the 1490s, Europeans would have faced stronger, more prepared American states instead of vulnerable societies reeling from disease and conquest. The clash would still come, but it might have been far more balanced. Perhaps treaties rather than outright conquest. Perhaps alliances instead of rapid colonization. The entire age of colonial empires could have looked completely different. Another fascinating layer comes when we consider the global economy. Silver from the New World flooded into Europe and then into Asia, fueling trade with China and creating one of the first truly global markets. Without that influx of silver, the Ming dynasty might not have shifted its economy so heavily towards silver trade, perhaps delaying the collapse that eventually came in the 17th century. The whole trajectory of East Asia could have been altered by the absence of Columbus. And let us not forget the cultural dimension. Our understanding of the Renaissance and Enlightenment is tied to the wealth and ideas flowing from contact with the Americas. Without this shock to the system, would Europe have experienced the same burst of creativity? Would thinkers like Montaigne or Locke or Newton have been shaped differently by a world less connected? The very foundation of modern Western thought might have emerged slower or in an altered form. Yet, at the heart of this scenario lies a sobering truth. History rarely gives second chances. The Columbian Exchange brought crops like maize, potatoes, and tomatoes to Europe, which reshaped diets and population growth. Across the globe, millions lived or died based on these new foods. Without them, famine could have struck Europe harder, and population growth might have slowed drastically. In that case, Asia and Africa may have held demographic advantages over Europe for far longer, shifting the center of global power away from the West. So, what if Columbus had never reached America? The answer is not that nothing would have happened, but rather that everything would have unfolded differently. The Spanish Empire might not have become the superpower it was. The Aztec and Inca might have stood as equal civilizations to the kingdoms of Europe. The global economy might have been delayed in becoming interconnected. And the very foods we eat today might never have reached our tables. A single voyage altered the fate of continents. Without it, the world would be unrecognizable.
Scenario 2. Mongols conquered Europe. What if Mongol horsemen thundered past Paris and Rome, turning Europe into part of the largest empire in history? Among the many crossroads of history, few are as dramatic as the rise of the Mongol Empire. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the Mongols created the largest land empire the world has ever seen, stretching from the Pacific to the edges of Europe. Yet in our timeline, the Mongol advance into Europe stopped short at Hungary and Poland in the 13th century. Their retreat was due to the death of the Great Khan, which forced generals back to Mongolia for the election of a successor. But what if that had not happened? What if the Mongols had pressed forward and completed the conquest of Europe? To imagine this world, we must first understand the scale of Mongol power at the time. Their armies were not simply horsemen rampaging across the plains. They were organized, disciplined, and highly mobile. They used sophisticated strategies, espionage, and siege technology, borrowed from the Chinese and Persians. Europe was fragmented, with kingdoms often fighting one another. The Mongols would have faced divided foes, unable to present a united defense. It is entirely plausible that cities like Vienna, Paris, or even Rome could have fallen under Mongol control. If Europe had been conquered, the immediate effect would have been the collapse of the feudal order. Kings and nobles would lose power as Mongol governors and administrators imposed their own system. Instead of a Europe of monarchies and castles, we might see a continent ruled through Mongol-appointed officials. The Catholic Church would likely have lost its dominance, since the Mongols practiced religious tolerance and often absorbed local beliefs into their empire. Christianity might have survived, but without the same centralized authority of the Pope in Rome. A fragmented and weakened church would have meant no Renaissance, no Reformation, and no age of exploration in the form we know. The Mongols also created networks of trade and communication, known as the Pax Mongolica. Under their rule, merchants could travel across Eurasia with relative safety, from China to the Middle East and into Europe. If Europe were part of this system, the continent might have been drawn into Asian trade far earlier. Silk, porcelain, spices, and ideas could have flowed directly into Paris or London centuries before the actual age of exploration. Instead of Europeans sailing west to reach Asia, the great cultural exchange would already be happening on land. Europe could have become more of a partner in an Asian-centered world economy, rather than the initiator of global empire. But would Mongol rule have lasted forever? That is unlikely. The empire was vast and difficult to govern, even in our timeline. Internal divisions and succession struggles tore it apart. If Europe had been conquered, it too would eventually have broken free. But by the time that happened, European societies would have been profoundly altered, their languages, governments, and economies shaped by Mongol influence. Imagine an early modern Europe where city-states operated under Mongol-style tax systems, where Asian innovations in science, medicine, and technology spread far faster and deeper than they did in our timeline. The printing press, for example, might not have emerged in Germany, but somewhere further east due to the accelerated cultural exchange. There is also the question of military technology. The Mongols were masters of mounted warfare and the composite bow. If Europeans had lived under their domination, they might have adopted these technologies more widely. A Europe trained in steppe-style cavalry warfare could have altered the later balance of power when gunpowder weapons arrived. By the 15th century, we might have seen a hybrid civilization, blending Mongol and European tactics and culture, creating something entirely new, neither purely Asian nor European. Of course, not all consequences would be positive. The Mongols often relied on brutal methods of conquest. Cities that resisted were annihilated, populations were slaughtered to instill fear. If the same approach had been used in Europe, entire cultural centers might have been wiped from the map. Some of the great cathedrals and cities of medieval Europe might never have survived. On the other hand, Mongol tolerance for science and artisanship could have led to the preservation of knowledge that Europe actually lost in the Dark Ages. The balance between destruction and preservation is uncertain. Perhaps the most intriguing question is what this would mean for the later rise of the modern world. If Europe never launched the age of exploration because it was integrated into Mongol trade routes, the discovery of the Americas might have been delayed or taken by Asian powers. China already had fleets sailing across the Indian Ocean under Admiral Zheng He in the 15th century. In this alternate timeline, it is possible that a Chinese or Indian expedition would reach the New World before Columbus. The global order we know today, dominated by European powers, might instead have been dominated by Asian empires centuries earlier. So, what if the Mongols had conquered Europe? The world would not simply be Asia controlled from Beijing and Europe enslaved under Mongol yokes. Rather, it would be a complex blend of cultures, technologies, and institutions. Europe as we know it might never have risen to global dominance. Instead, it might have remained a region shaped and overshadowed by the great powers of Asia.
Scenario 3. Black Death never happened. What if the plague never struck, and Europe stayed trapped under feudal chains with no Renaissance or Reformation? Few events altered the course of history as dramatically as the Black Death of the 14th century. The plague swept across Europe, killing anywhere from a third to half of the population. Entire villages vanished, fields went untilled, and social orders collapsed. It was not only a human tragedy, but also a turning point that reshaped economies, religions, and politics. But what if the Black Death had never happened? What if this single catastrophe had somehow been avoided? The first and most obvious difference would be demographic. Europe in the early 1300s was already densely populated. Food supplies were stretched thin, and peasants struggled under feudal obligations. When the plague struck, it created massive labor shortages, ironically giving survivors more bargaining power. Wages rose, serfs began to break free from the land, and feudalism weakened. Without the plague, however, this shift would not have happened. The aristocracy would have maintained control longer, and peasants would have remained bound to the land. Europe might have stayed a feudal society well into the modern age, delaying the rise of capitalism and individual rights. The cultural consequences would be just as significant. The Black Death inspired waves of religious fervor, mysticism, and eventually skepticism. It shook the authority of the Church as people questioned why such suffering was allowed to happen. The seeds of the Reformation were planted in this crisis. Without the plague, the Catholic Church may have retained far stronger control over European society. Perhaps Martin Luther, centuries later, would not have found the same audience for his protests against corruption and indulgences. The unity of Christendom might have survived longer, keeping Europe under a more centralized spiritual authority. Economically, the absence of the Black Death would mean slower innovation. With abundant labor, landowners would have little reason to adopt new technologies like water mills or more efficient farming methods.
Urbanization might have slowed without surplus laborers fleeing to towns in search of opportunity. The Renaissance, with its explosion of art, science, and humanism, may have emerged later or in a muted form. Instead of 15th-century Florence bursting with ideas, perhaps Europe would have remained locked in medieval traditions until much later. The global consequences are also worth exploring. Without the labor crisis that followed the plague, Europe may not have had the same drive to seek wealth overseas. The voyages of discovery that began with Portugal and Spain in the 15th century were fueled by societies seeking new opportunities and trade routes, in part made possible by the social and economic upheaval of the post-plague world. If that upheaval never occurred, perhaps Columbus would not have sailed west. Vasco da Gama might not have rounded Africa, or if they had, the urgency and scale of colonization might have been far reduced. The Americas could have remained untouched for longer, giving indigenous civilizations more time to strengthen and expand. Another striking point is population growth. Europe, without the Black Death, would have had tens of millions more people by the 1500s. This might sound like a strength, but it could also mean crisis. More mouths to feed with the same agricultural technology could lead to recurring famines, wars over resources, and instability. Rather than fueling an age of progress, Europe might have collapsed under its own weight. Mass starvation and peasant revolts could have torn apart kingdoms long before the Enlightenment arrived. On the other hand, it is possible that population pressure would have forced earlier reforms. Kings and rulers might have had to modernize agriculture faster or encourage colonization sooner to relieve the strain. Perhaps Europeans would still have launched voyages across the seas, but in a different spirit, not one of conquest, born from post-plague opportunity, but one of desperation, born from overpopulation. The shape of colonial empires would have been altered, the timing shifted, but the impulse may have still come. There is also the question of science. Some historians argue that the Black Death forced Europeans to rethink old ideas. The collapse of trust in traditional medicine opened the door for new approaches. Without this crisis, the dominance of ancient Greek and Roman medical theories might have persisted even longer, delaying the breakthroughs that eventually came in anatomy, biology, and later germ theory. The entire scientific revolution could have been slowed. But not all would be negative. A Europe without the Black Death would not carry the same deep scars. Entire generations would not grow up surrounded by death and despair as we see in medieval paintings. Perhaps art and culture would have flourished in a more optimistic environment, rather than being so haunted by images of skeletons and decay as we see in medieval paintings. Perhaps the Renaissance would have been different, less obsessed with mortality and more focused on continuity and harmony. So what if the Black Death had never happened? Europe might have been wealthier in numbers but poorer in ideas. It might have remained trapped in feudal structures longer, with fewer opportunities for social mobility. The Church could have been stronger, the Renaissance delayed, the Reformation muted, and the Age of Exploration postponed. In some ways, the plague, though devastating, accelerated the birth of the modern world. Without it, our present might look strangely medieval.
Scenario 4. Napoleon won at Waterloo. What if Napoleon triumphed one last time and reshaped Europe into a French-led superstate decades ahead of its time? Among the great battles that decided the fate of nations, few are as iconic as Waterloo. In 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte faced the Allied armies of Britain and Prussia in a struggle that would determine the future of Europe. In our timeline, Napoleon was defeated and sent into exile, marking the end of his ambitions and the restoration of monarchies across Europe. But what if Napoleon had won at Waterloo? What if the Emperor of the French had triumphed one last time? To begin, we must imagine the battlefield unfolding differently. Perhaps the Prussians under Blücher failed to arrive in time. Perhaps Wellington miscalculated his defenses, or perhaps Napoleon had been in better health that day. A French victory would have shattered the coalition morale. Britain might have retreated across the Channel. Prussia forced to withdraw, leaving the continent once again under the shadow of Napoleonic dominance. The immediate effect would be the survival of Napoleon's empire. France would remain the strongest power on the continent. Napoleon could have dictated peace on his own terms, dismantling the coalition and forcing recognition of his rule. This would delay or even prevent the conservative order established by the Congress of Vienna. Instead of Europe returning to old monarchies, the map would remain shaped by Napoleon's reforms. Unified states like Germany and Italy might have emerged sooner under French influence rather than waiting until the late 19th century. The political changes would be immense. Napoleon was not merely a conqueror, he was also a reformer. He spread ideas of meritocracy, civil codes, secular education, and centralized administration. Wherever his armies went, the old feudal privileges of aristocracy were eroded. If he had won at Waterloo, these principles might have been cemented across Europe, creating a continent more modern decades earlier. The monarchies that survived in Britain, Austria, and Russia would have faced enormous pressure from revolutionary ideals backed by Napoleon's power. Economically, a victorious France could have reshaped global trade. Britain was the dominant naval power, but even the Royal Navy might have struggled to contain a resurgent France allied with continental partners. French control of ports and markets across Europe could have weakened British commerce and perhaps shifted the center of industrial growth to the continent. The Industrial Revolution might have taken a different path, with France or even Germany surpassing Britain in innovation and industry. Globally, the effects would be dramatic. The Americas were in the midst of independence struggles during Napoleon's time. His influence might have supported or hindered these revolutions depending on his strategy. Perhaps Napoleon would recognize the independence of Latin American states to weaken Spain and Britain, or perhaps he would attempt to reassert control over colonies lost in earlier wars. A French-dominated Europe could also have clashed more directly with the United States, whose rise might have been delayed in the shadow of a powerful transatlantic empire. There is also the question of nationalism. In our history, the Congress of Vienna attempted to suppress nationalist and liberal movements. Napoleon, however, encouraged them when they suited his purposes. A victorious Napoleon might have encouraged Italian and German unification under leaders loyal to him. Imagine a Europe where by the mid-19th century, a unified Italy and a French-aligned Germany already exist. This would completely alter the balance of power when the 20th century arrives. Of course, not all consequences would be positive. Napoleon's rule was authoritarian. His victories often relied on constant warfare and conscription. A Europe under his domination could have faced endless cycles of conflict as he sought to maintain control. His centralized model might have stifled certain freedoms, even while advancing equality in law and education. Furthermore, Russia would not have accepted French dominance quietly. Another war in the East would be almost inevitable. Yet it is undeniable that Napoleon's survival would have created a world far different from our own. No Congress of Vienna, no century of relative peace under British dominance. Instead, a Europe constantly reshaped by the ambitions of one man. Perhaps the revolutions of 1848 would never have occurred because their ideals had already been realized earlier under French reforms. Or perhaps those revolutions would have been even bloodier struggles against Napoleonic authoritarianism. One final dimension to consider is the cultural sphere. Napoleon was a patron of art, science, and architecture. His empire could have fostered an earlier spread of modern culture and education across Europe. Universities restructured under French systems might have advanced science faster.
Literature and philosophy might have taken on new themes of power, progress, and empire centuries before our actual modernist movements. So, what if Napoleon had won at Waterloo? Europe would have remained under French leadership, the map redrawn, the monarchies weakened, and modern ideas spread more rapidly. The 19th century could have belonged to France, not Britain. The world as we know it, industrial, democratic, and globally connected, would still have emerged, but under a very different banner.
Scenario 5. The Soviet Union never collapsed. What if the red flag still flew over Moscow, and the Cold War never ended, dividing the world into two eternal empires? Few moments in recent memory reshaped the world as dramatically as the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. For nearly half a century, the USSR stood as the rival superpower to the United States, its existence defining the Cold War, its fall marking what many called the end of history. But what if the Soviet Union had never collapsed? What if the red flag still flew over Moscow? To begin, we must understand the fragility of the late Soviet system. By the 1980s, the economy was stagnating, oil revenues were falling, and military spending was draining resources. Gorbachev introduced reforms like glasnost and perestroika, hoping to modernize, but instead, he unleashed forces that tore the Union apart. In our timeline, nationalist movements gained strength, the Berlin Wall fell, and within a few years the Soviet Union dissolved. Yet imagine a scenario where these reforms were either more successful or where hardliners held power tightly, preventing disintegration. In this alternate timeline, Eastern Europe might never have broken free. Countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia would remain within the Soviet sphere, their revolutions suppressed or carefully managed. The Berlin Wall might still stand, Germany still divided between East and West. The Cold War would not have ended in 1991, but stretched on into the 21st century, shaping politics, culture, and technology in profound ways. One of the most immediate consequences would be the absence of American unipolar dominance. In our world, the 1990s were defined by U.S. power, with interventions in the Middle East, the expansion of NATO, and the globalization of Western culture. Without Soviet collapse, every move by the United States would meet with direct competition. The Gulf War, for example, might have been contested by the Soviets supporting Iraq against American forces. The Middle East could have become a constant proxy battlefield between the two superpowers. Economically, the Soviet Union would still face enormous challenges. Its planned economy struggled with inefficiency and corruption. Yet with tighter control and gradual reforms, it might have limped forward, sustained by energy exports and technological rivalry with the West. The arms race could have continued, spurring both sides to invest heavily in military and space technology. Imagine the 21st century beginning not with cooperation on the International Space Station, but with competing Soviet and American colonies on the Moon or even Mars. Culturally, the divide between East and West would remain stark. Instead of the spread of Western consumer culture across Russia and Eastern Europe, we might see the continuation of socialist ideals, propaganda art, and centralized education. Generations raised under this system would grow up with entirely different values. Perhaps Western music, literature, and film would still seep across borders, but the ideological struggle would remain alive, keeping billions of people divided into two competing visions of society. There is also the question of China. In our timeline, China rose as the new global power after the Cold War, often filling the vacuum left by the Soviets. But if the USSR had survived, China might have been more cautious or even remained an ally under a broader socialist bloc. The 21st century could have opened with a world divided into two camps, one led by the United States and its allies, the other by a union of Soviet and Chinese power. The balance of influence in Africa, Latin America, and Asia would be entirely different. Technologically, the rivalry might have accelerated certain developments.
The Internet, for instance, spread rapidly in the 1990s because of American dominance. In a bipolar world, the Soviets would have developed their own version, perhaps closed off and heavily censored, leading to a fractured global network. Two internets might exist side by side, one Western, open and commercial, the other Soviet, centralized and controlled. The flow of information, knowledge, and culture would be fundamentally altered. Domestically, within the Soviet Union, survival would not erase its problems. Corruption, inefficiency, and lack of freedoms would still weigh heavily. Yet nationalism in republics like Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltic states could have been suppressed with greater force, perhaps through military intervention. This would create tension and resentment, but the Union could persist as it had for decades, held together by repression and centralized power. The cost would be high, but survival was not impossible. So what if the Soviet Union had never collapsed? The world would not be one of peace and globalization, but one of ongoing rivalry. A world where nuclear arsenals remained at the center of politics, where the Berlin Wall still divided Germany, where wars in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia were fought as Cold War proxies. The optimism of the 1990s would vanish, replaced by a constant shadow of superpower confrontation. In this timeline, the 21st century might not be the age of American dominance, but an era defined by dual empires locked in perpetual struggle. Humanity might have advanced in technology and exploration, but at the price of freedom and unity. The red flag flying in Moscow would symbolize not just survival, but a world forever divided.